Echoes in the dark, the Atlanta child murders. The city in transition. The 1970s brought a strange tension to Atlanta, Georgia, a city caught in the middle of transformation. By day, Atlanta was a rising southern metropolis, freshly branded as the city too busy to hate. Skyscrapers bloomed downtown, and black political leadership, spearheaded by Mayor Maynard Jackson, promised a new era for African Americans in the South. But at night, fear crept through the neighborhoods. Predominantly black communities like Mechanicsville, Summerhill, and Southwest Atlanta felt the unease first. Something was wrong. Children were disappearing. The city's black families, long marginalized, didn't trust the police. There was a deep sense that their kids weren't a priority. Early missing persons reports were shrugged off as runaways. Community flyers were ignored, and the mainstream media barely mentioned the names. That would all change in July 1979, with the death of a 14-year-old boy named Edward Hope Smith, known to his friends as Teddy. The first bodies? On July 21, 1979, the body of Edward Smith was found in a wooded area along Niskey Lake Road. He had been missing for 3 days. Police ruled his death as caused by a .22 caliber bullet, but offered little context. The next day, 13-year-old Alfred Evans was discovered dead in the same area. 2 young black boys, murdered, dumped in the woods, in the same week, in the same city. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was the beginning. From 1979 to 1981, at least 29 black children, teens, and young adults would be abducted, strangled, stabbed, or beaten, their bodies dumped in rivers, abandoned buildings, and brushed near. Atlanta spiraled. Names began to appear in the press. Yusef Bell, Angel Lanier, Eric Middlebrooks, Luby Getter. Each case echoed the last. Young, poor, black, missing for days, then found dead. The killings didn't follow a perfect pattern, but the profile emerged. Children between 7 and 17, mostly male, many known to each other or from the same schools and neighborhoods. Parents organized night watches. Volunteers formed search parties. Local radio stations read the names of missing children every hour. Still, the bodies kept coming, a city on edge. By early 1980, the reality set in. There was a serial killer in Atlanta, but the authorities were slow to admit it. The Atlanta Police Department, APD, and the newly elected Mayor Maynard Jackson faced pressure from both sides. Protect the city's image and protect the city's children. Initially, the APD hesitated to connect the cases. Each victim had slightly different injuries or circumstances. Some were beaten, others strangled. Some appeared sexually assaulted, others not. But as more children went missing, public outrage boiled over. On March 4, 1980, 9-year-old Yusef Bell disappeared on his way to the store. His body was found weeks later in an abandoned building. He had been strangled. That same month, 12-year-old Jeffrey Mathis vanished. He would remain missing for a year before his body was discovered near a freeway. Parents were furious. Community leaders demanded federal help. Civil rights activists accused city leaders of complacency. Finally, in mid-1980, the FBI was brought in. A task force was formed, the largest since the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination investigation. But the killer, or killers, were still out there, and the worst was yet to come: the formation of the task force. By summer 1980, the Atlanta child murders had gripped the city in a state of permanent fear. Citizens demanded action. The Atlanta Police Department, overwhelmed and undertrained for a serial investigation of this magnitude, reached out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thus, the Atlanta Homicide Task Force was born, a joint operation between the APD, FBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and several local jurisdictions. Wayne Williams' name wouldn't surface until much later. For now, the task force was still focused on finding patterns, building a profile, and bringing calm to a city spiraling toward chaos. Agents worked 8-hour days. Bulletin boards lined with victims' names, photos, and maps filled every wall. Dozens of black children had disappeared under similar circumstances. It was too specific to be coincidence, but too scattered to be clearly organized. A profiler named John E. Douglas, later famous for his work on the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, was brought in. For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Douglas began building the now famous psychological profile of the killer. Likely African, male, mid to late 20s, grew up or currently lived in the same low-income black neighborhoods as his victims, could likely move in and out of the community unnoticed. Possibly someone who felt inferior and displaced his anger onto children. The profile shocked some, especially the assumption that the killer might be black. But to the FBI, it made sense. A white man targeting black children in poor neighborhoods would stand out. This killer blended in, but profiling wasn't enough. The task force began tracking known sex offenders, interviewing drug addicts, and canvassing abandoned buildings. Every report of a missing child was now treated as a potential murder. Still, the deaths kept mounting. No arrests, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no suspects, just bodies and silence. The pattern emerges. By late 1980, the Atlanta child murders had crossed the threshold from tragedy into terror. At least 15 children had been killed in just over a year. The victims shared eerie similarities. All were black. Most were male. Most were between the ages of 7 and 14. Many were last seen walking alone, often doing chores or going to the store. Most were found in remote wooded areas, near rivers or under highway bridges. Despite the scope of the task force, no one was close to solving it. There was still no forensic evidence to tie the killings together, no consistent murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. In a city known for racial divisions and mistrust in law enforcement, the community was split. Some believed the killer was an insider, someone from the neighborhood. Others were convinced this was a hate crime, or worse, a government conspiracy. That fear wasn't unfounded. Atlanta had long been a city of contradictions, proud of its civil rights legacy, yet haunted by poverty and systemic racism. Many black families, especially in the neighborhoods where children were vanishing, felt abandoned. Community meetings grew more heated. Ministers gave sermons naming the children aloud, refusing to let the world forget. "These are not just names," said one preacher during a televised vigil. "These are our babies, and someone is hunting them." Among the dead in this phase were Patrick Rogers, 16, and Luby Getter, 14, both of whom were found with injuries indicating strangulation. Some victims were discovered with their clothes removed. In others, it was clear the killer had dumped them in bodies of water, perhaps to obscure forensic clues. The FBI finally made a breakthrough, not with fingerprints or DNA, but with fibers. Several victims had unusual green carpet fibers and dog hairs on their clothing. If they could trace those fibers to a source, maybe, just maybe, they could catch the killer. But time was running out. Names lost to time. The list of victims grew so long, newspapers began printing full-page memorials. Local black-owned radio stations read names over quiet gospel music every morning. Some of the children were known well in their neighborhoods. Others slipped quietly into the fog of memory, but all of them had stories. Angel Lanier, age 12, was found tied to a tree, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her mother later said she had a smile so bright it lit up a room. Eric Middlebrooks, 14, was a Boy Scout, last seen fixing a neighbor's bicycle before his body was found behind a trash bin. Latanya Wilson, 7, was abducted from her own bedroom window. Her body wouldn't be found for over a year. Joseph Bell, 15, had a learning disability. He loved music and wanted to be a drummer. Some of the names became symbols of the horror. Others became statistics. By spring of 1981, more than 24 children and young adults were dead or missing. A city that prided itself on resilience was now in mourning and on edge. Parents kept their kids home from school. Curfews were enforced. Street corners, once filled with laughter, now sat silent. No one knew when or if the killing would stop. But behind the scenes, the FBI was watching the rivers, combing the fiber evidence and listening. The killer was getting sloppy, and the trap was about to close. The River Watch. By the spring of 1981, the FBI's fiber analysis had become the investigation's only tangible lead. Agents noticed that many of the victims, bodies particularly the older teens, had been found in or near water. Rivers like the Chattahoochee, South River, and Proctor Creek became disposal sites. The Bureau theorized that the killer might be using bridges at night to dump the bodies, hoping the current would destroy evidence or wash the victims far from where they had been killed. So the FBI set a trap. They began a covert stakeout of dozens of bridges throughout Atlanta, placing agents undercover at various vantage points. They worked overnight shifts, staying completely hidden. The operation was long, methodical, and grueling. On May 22, 1981, around 2:52 a.m., two officers positioned underneath the James Jackson Parkway Bridge over the Chattahoochee River heard a splash. They radioed nearby officers, who saw a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon slowly pulling off the bridge. Inside the car was a 23-year-old black man named Wayne Bertram Williams. The agents stopped him. Williams claimed he was a music producer on his way to audition a young singer, but his story quickly raised suspicions. He couldn't name the person he was auditioning. The address he gave didn't exist. His clothes were covered in dog hairs and fibers, and he was driving alone at 3 a.m. in a high-crime area during a citywide curfew. They let him go that night, but they had found their suspect. 2 days later, the body of Nathaniel Cater, 27, was pulled from the river near the bridge. He had last been seen with Wayne Williams. The FBI's manhunt had found its target, a name emerges. Once Wayne Williams became a person of interest, the task force turned its full force on him. Born in 1958, Williams was a quiet, intelligent man from southwest Atlanta. He was the son of two public school teachers and had attended college briefly. He dabbled in music, claimed to manage young bands, and aspired to work in radio. He also had access to kids. Many of the victims had dreams of being in the music industry. Williams had promised several of them opportunities to record or perform. The FBI soon discovered he had approached multiple boys about modeling or radio interviews. When they searched his home, agents found a gold mine: green carpet fibers consistent with those found on multiple victims, dog hairs that matched those on several boys' clothing, rope, gloves, maps, and surveillance gear, a wall covered in amateur radio equipment indicating he had been tracking police frequencies. The dog hairs became especially crucial. They were from a rare German Shepherd mix. The FBI collected hair from Williams' family dog, and forensic analysts found mitochondrial DNA matches, not conclusive, but highly suggestive. Most damning were the fiber matches. The same green carpet, yellow blanket fibers, and vehicle seat fabric were found on more than a dozen victims. It was circumstantial, but it was overwhelming. On June 21, 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested and charged with the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, two adult victims whose bodies had been found in the river. The city exhaled. After 2 years of horror, someone was finally in handcuffs. But the relief was short-lived. Not everyone was convinced he was the killer. The arrest of Wayne Williams. Wayne Williams' arrest sparked an immediate storm. Media coverage exploded. Journalists from across the country descended on Atlanta. CNN, still in its infancy, ran near-continuous coverage. Photos of Williams, nerdy, bespectacled, with a soft face and calm voice, contrasted sharply with the monstrous image people had built in their minds. Police hoped the public would now calm down, but the truth was far more complicated. The state of Georgia only charged Williams with 2 murders, both of adult men, yet officials quickly closed the books on over 20 child murder cases, unofficially linking them to Williams despite a lack of direct evidence. Critics cried foul. How can you charge him with 2 adults and claim it solves 29 murders, most of them children? Rev. Joseph Boone, community leader. Families of some victims, particularly the parents of Yusef Bell Angel Lanier and Eric Middlebrooks, said they were never shown real proof that Williams had anything to do with their children's deaths. Others were simply desperate for closure. They wanted the nightmare to be over, and Williams fit the profile. The community fractured along lines of class, trauma, and belief. Some saw Williams as a scapegoat, a convenient way to end the crisis and avoid deeper accountability. Others saw him as a quiet redditor, someone who had fooled the city. The upcoming trial would have to decide what the evidence couldn't fully prove, and it would become one of the most controversial in Georgia's history. The trial begins. The trial of Wayne Williams began in January 1982 at the Fulton County Courthouse. It drew national attention, not just because of the horrific nature of the crimes, but because of the racial, political, and psychological implications. Williams faced charges for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, two adult black men. The prosecution, however, was allowed to introduce evidence linking him to 10 additional child murders, a legal strategy designed to show a pattern. The courtroom was packed with journalists, grieving families, and curious Atlantans. At the defense table sat a man many described as odd, fidgety, and unemotional, yet not the image of a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lewis Slayton, leaned heavily on fiber evidence. Their forensic experts testified that fibers from Williams' home, car, bedspread, and dog matched those found on numerous victims. The state's key argument was simple. Wherever Wayne Williams went, these fibers went. And wherever these fibers were found, so were the bodies. They also produced witnesses who claimed Williams had lured children with promises of fame, lied about his business ventures, and was often seen in the company of young boys around the time of their disappearances. The defense, led by Al Binder, countered by attacking the integrity of the fiber analysis. He claimed it was circumstantial and that the prosecution had no eyewitnesses, confession, or murder weapon. Binder also suggested Williams had been framed, possibly to quiet growing public outcry. He pointed to inconsistencies in the police timeline and gaps in surveillance. Wayne Williams himself took the stand. A risky move. He denied knowing the victims, denied any involvement, and accused police of building a case around him for political reasons. But under cross-examination, he became combative and evasive, raising eyebrows. It was a complex, tense trial, but the jury was not swayed by the defense's claims. On February 27, 1982, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury found Wayne Williams guilty of the murders of Cater and Payne. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Closing the cases, the conviction of Wayne Williams should have brought closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter of controversy. Immediately after the trial, the Atlanta Police Department announced they would close 22 of the 29 child murder cases, attributing them to Williams based on patterns of evidence. But these cases were never tried in court. No charges were filed. This decision split the city in two. Some parents were relieved, convinced that their children's killer had been caught. Others were furious, claiming police were simply clearing their caseload without real proof. Even within the APD, doubts lingered. A few investigators believed Williams may have killed some victims, particularly the older teens, but not all. Why? Because the early victims, like Edward Smith, Angel Lanier, and Yusuf Bell, differed from the later ones. They were younger, and some showed signs of sexual abuse, a pattern not seen in the adult victims tied to Williams. There were also rumors, whispers of child sex rings, of police cover-ups, of Klansmen involved in the earliest deaths. The idea that one man, a 23-year-old failed music promoter, was solely responsible for a 2-year wave of terror, stretching across dozens of neighborhoods, never sat right with everyone. Too many. Closing the cases without further investigation felt like a betrayal. "My baby was worth more than a folder stamped closed," said Camilla Bell, mother of 9-year-old Yusuf. Still, the killings stopped after Williams' arrest. Was that coincidence or proof? The answer would remain tangled in suspicion, pain, and a city's desperate need to move on. The community reacts. The conviction of Wayne Williams did not bring Atlanta together. It divided it further. In the white suburbs, many saw the verdict as the end. The killer had been caught, and the city could begin to heal. In the black neighborhoods, where the children had lived and died, it was different. Distrust ran deep. Families questioned why it took so many deaths for the authorities to act. Why hadn't the FBI been brought in sooner? Why weren't the earliest disappearances treated seriously? And why had so many victims' parents been ignored when they begged for help? The black press, especially outlets like the Atlanta Voice, began publishing investigative series suggesting that the case was not fully solved. They pointed to the lack of forensic evidence in some murders and raised concerns about the city's desire to protect its image over its citizens. Religious leaders held vigils not just for the dead, but for the truth. Candlelight processions marched through the streets of Summerhill, Mechanicsville, and Pittsburgh, the very neighborhoods that had lost the most. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories spread. Some believed Williams was a patsy, a stand-in to ease tensions. Others believed that the Ku Klux Klan was involved and that files had been sealed to prevent race riots. A few believed the real killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight. The tragedy had become bigger than a man or a trial. It was about institutional neglect, the expendability of black lives, and the scars that linger long after the media leaves. Wayne in prison. After his 1982 conviction, Wayne Williams began serving 2 consecutive life sentences at Valdosta State Prison, later transferred to Telfair State Prison in Georgia. From the very beginning, Williams maintained his innocence. He granted interviews with journalists, wrote letters to civil rights leaders, and repeatedly filed appeals, claiming he had been framed or railroaded due to public pressure and political convenience. In an interview from 1991, Williams said, "They needed a killer. I fit the story, but the story wasn't real. I didn't kill those children." His prison life was relatively quiet. No known disciplinary issues, no significant outbursts. He focused on reading, legal study, and correspondence. Over the years, he became something of a mystery figure, too quiet to be a textbook sociopath, too strange to be easily dismissed, too convicted to ignore. Supporters of Williams formed advocacy groups, including one called Committee to Free Wayne Williams. Some Black Atlantans believed that while he may have killed older victims, he wasn't responsible for the entire chain of murders, especially the youngest children. They pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, lack of physical evidence tying him to many of the crimes, and the city's eagerness to close cases after his arrest. Meanwhile, opponents of Williams, including many families of the later victims, remained convinced of his guilt. The battle over his innocence played out in books, radio segments, and documentaries, including a 1995 HBO special and later, the 2019 Netflix series Manhunter, which depicted the Williams case as central to the history of FBI profiling. Yet through it all, Wayne Williams remained behind bars, aging quietly, watching as the city and the story moved forward, but never fully away. A city rebuilds. In the aftermath of the murders and the trial, Atlanta entered a period of rebuilding socially, politically, and spiritually. Mayor Andrew Young, who succeeded Maynard Jackson, emphasized healing and reform. He pushed for new investments in underserved neighborhoods, youth programs, and stronger police-community relations. But the emotional damage ran deep. Entire communities had grown up with trauma. Children from the early 1980s remembered not being allowed to walk to school, not playing outside, being told to beware of strangers, vans, bridges, the dark. Fear had become their language. In Black churches across Atlanta, pastors called for peace, accountability, and vigilance. The pulpit became a place not just of mourning, but of activism. The murders became a cautionary tale taught in schools, whispered in homes, and passed down from parents to children. For many Atlantans, the era was defined by silence, not just the silence of missing children, but the silence that followed. The unanswered questions, the cases closed without trial, the names forgotten by those outside the neighborhoods. Local journalists tried to keep the story alive. A few victims' parents dedicated their lives to community safety and youth outreach. But by the late 1990s, the Atlanta child murders had largely faded from national conversation until the city decided to take another look, questions that never die. In March 2019, nearly 4 decades after the first body was found, Atlanta's newly elected mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, made an announcement.
Reopened an investigation into a very, very dark series of crimes in Atlanta. I think it was between 79 and 81, in which, gosh, it's hard to even say this, 28 children, teens, and adults with disabilities were all murdered. An Atlanta native named Wayne Williams was arrested, tried, and convicted in 2 of the killings, but that leaves in my math 26 unsolved murders. So in the reopening of this investigation, have you discovered anything new so far?
The city would reopen the investigation into the Atlanta child murders. Modern forensic technology, including advanced DNA, Analysis had come a long way since 1981. Bottoms said the city owed it to the victims and their families to see if the truth could be revisited, confirmed, or uncovered anew. She said, "It may not bring complete closure, but it may bring a small sense of peace, and it may validate the pain that has been carried by this community for far too long." The initiative included retesting biological evidence from open and closed cases, re-examining the fiber evidence used to convict Williams, compiling a public digital archive of victims and case files, holding community forums to gather oral history and renewed testimonies. For some, it felt too little, too late. Others, however, felt a long overdue reckoning had begun. Wayne Williams, still incarcerated, welcomed the reopening. He offered to provide DNA samples. He reiterated his innocence, writing in a public letter, "If the science can prove I did this, so be it. But if it clears me, will the world finally listen?" As of 2023, no official exoneration had occurred. No new charges had been filed. The reinvestigation was ongoing, but something had shifted. The story had come full circle, not with closure, but with accountability. And in the quiet corners of Atlanta's oldest neighborhoods, the names of the lost were once again being spoken aloud. Reopening the files, the city's 2019 decision to reopen the case marked a critical moment, not just for Atlanta, but for the broader conversation around justice, race, and memory. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, Police Chief Erica Shields, and District Attorney Paul Howard oversaw the formation of a cold case working group. The mission was simple in theory, yet massive in scope. Review all 29 official Atlanta child murder cases. Using modern forensic tools and digital case reassembly, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, was tasked with reanalyzing evidence using mitochondrial DNA matching, touch DNA analysis, newly available for degraded samples, reprocessing hair, fiber, and biological evidence, cross-referencing known serial offenders, DNA databases. Old case files were digitized, and physical evidence was moved to secure laboratories. But this presented challenges. Many of the original samples had degraded, been misfiled, or were no longer suitable for testing due to contamination or chain of custody concerns. Still, some hope emerged. In 2020, the GBI announced it had isolated usable DNA from the cases of Eric Middlebrooks and Patrick Baltazar to victims long believed to be linked to Wayne Williams. Testing was still underway. The city also promised transparency. A public online memorial archive was created, listing all 29 victims with biographical details, case notes, and family interviews. It was not just a forensic effort, it was a human one. For the families, the reopening was bittersweet. For decades, many had felt forgotten. Now, with new eyes on their children's cases, there was a sense of dignity, even if justice still felt out of reach. Voices of the families, for the surviving family members of the murdered children, time had not dulled the pain. Most had been teenagers or young parents in 1979, 1981. By 2019, they were grandparents, retirees, or aging alone, still carrying the weight of unanswered grief. Camilla Bell, mother of 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, had long been one of the most outspoken voices. She never believed Wayne Williams killed her son. She insisted Yusuf's case was mishandled from day one. No physical evidence, no confessions, no justice. He was a bright child, she said. He sang in the choir. He didn't run away. Someone took him, and someone got away with it. Frida Jones, whose brother Patrick Baltazar was found strangled in a vacant apartment, spoke quietly during a 2020 memorial. "People say time heals. I say time forgets. But I never did. Not one day." The city invited surviving relatives to town halls and healing sessions, where many told their stories publicly for the first time in decades. Some wept. Others remained stone-faced. A few said they were finally ready to forgive. Not the killer, but the system that failed them. A recurring theme emerged. It wasn't just that the murders had happened, it was how the victims were treated. As though they didn't matter. As though they were collateral damage in a city obsessed with progress. Some parents had died without ever seeing justice. But their children's names lived on in the voices of their siblings, cousins, and communities. For them, the reinvestigation wasn't about indictments or DNA. It was about memory, the legacy of the lost. The Atlanta child murders had become more than a criminal case. They had become a symbol of systemic failure, racial trauma, and the resilience of a community that refused to be silenced. Even decades later, the story reverberated across American culture. In 2010, acclaimed author James Baldwin wrote unfinished notes about the case before his death, calling it a mirror held up to Black America's disposability. In 2019, HBO's Atlanta's Missing and Murdered: The Lost Children reignited public debate. Donald Glover's award-winning series Atlanta featured a chilling, fictionalized subplot inspired by the murders. Musicians like Outkast and Killer Mike referenced the era in lyrics about growing up in Atlanta under fear. Perhaps the most important legacy was education. Atlanta's public schools added the case to civil rights curriculum. Local teachers used it to discuss policing, media bias, and the value of Black lives. Memorials were erected, not massive monuments, but quiet plaques, murals in alleyways, candlelit shrines on the corners where children once walked. A small museum exhibit, Children Taken, opened in 2022 in the historic Sweet Auburn district. It featured sneakers, old school photos, and voice recordings from survivors. One plaque read, "They were children, not statistics, not suspects, not runaways. They mattered." Even in death, the children had reshaped the city. They forced Atlanta to reckon with its image, not as the city too busy to hate, but as a city finally forced to stop and listen. The media and the murders. From the beginning, the role of the media in the Atlanta child murders was a double-edged sword. On one hand, press coverage helped bring national attention to a crisis Atlanta officials were slow to acknowledge. On the other, the sensationalism, racial bias, and uneven reporting shaped public perception in ways that harmed victims and complicated the truth. In the earliest days of the killings, local Black newspapers like the Atlanta Voice and the Atlanta Daily World were the first to sound the alarm. They ran front-page stories with headlines like, "Another Black child missing, who is next?" But mainstream outlets, including the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and national networks, were slow to catch on. The early disappearances were labeled as runaways, reinforcing the false belief that poor Black children simply vanished by choice. It wasn't until late 1980, after the murder count passed 10, that CBS, NBC, and ABC began extensive coverage. CNN, founded in Atlanta just months earlier, used the crisis to develop live, 24-hour news coverage, establishing itself as a national player. The tone of the reporting was often panic-driven. Serial killer on the loose, city in chaos, Atlanta terrorized. Images of sobbing mothers and body bags dominated the screen. But the names and stories of the victims were often reduced to blurbs. Some reporters, notably Tony Brown and Ed Gordon from Bet News, tried to push beyond the headlines. They interviewed families, dug into police failures, and questioned the narrative that Wayne Williams was solely responsible. When Williams was arrested, the media pivoted again, portraying him as an oddball, a loner, a genius gone mad. Reporters obsessed over his musical equipment and wiretapping devices, painting him as some kind of urban Bond villain. The trial was a media circus. Every moment in court was broadcast, every slip in Williams' testimony dissected. The public, overwhelmed with grief and eager for a resolution, was told again and again, this was the man, case closed. Years later, many journalists admitted the coverage had been flawed, rushed, and complicit in helping law enforcement shut the case quickly. "We wanted a villain," one retired anchor said. "And once we had one, we stopped asking questions." Unresolved cases. While Wayne Williams was convicted of 2 murders and linked unofficially to more than 20 others, many cases remain unsolved or heavily disputed. The list includes Angel Lanier, 12, found strangled with her hands tied, possibly sexually assaulted. No forensic link to Williams. Latanya Wilson, 7, abducted from her bedroom. Her body was not found for over a year. No direct connection to Williams. Luby Jeter, 14, last seen at a mall. His injuries suggested he had been beaten and suffocated. Williams denied knowing him. Jeffrey Mathis, 10, vanished in 1980. His body was discovered a year later. His case had inconsistencies that puzzled even the GBI. Some victims were older teens or adults, raising questions about the killer's motive or victim profile. Others were young girls, whose cases were often excluded from public lists, even though they fit the time and geographic pattern. What complicated matters further was the lack of uniform modus operandi. Some children were found in rivers, others in vacant lots. Some were naked, some clothed. Some were strangled, others bludgeoned. Critics of the investigation argue that these inconsistencies point to multiple killers, or at least copycats, who took advantage of the panic. In 1986, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation quietly reopened 5 of the original 29 cases without public announcement. No charges were ever filed. By 2024, as DNA testing advances, some cold case detectives continue working behind the scenes. But for the families of the unresolved victims, justice remains a ghost. Wayne's last appeal. Wayne Williams has never stopped fighting to clear his name. Over the past 4 decades, he has filed over a dozen appeals, citing improper jury selection, circumstantial evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, inability to face charges in the child cases he was accused of committing. All were denied. In 2007, Williams requested new DNA testing on the fiber and dog hair evidence used to convict him. The tests, conducted under supervision, were inconclusive. They neither exonerated him nor definitively proved his guilt. Prosecutors claimed this reaffirmed the original conviction. Williams disagreed. In 2019, following the city's decision to re-examine the case, Williams filed a formal request for exoneration, based on new evidence and emerging expert criticism of the original fiber testing methods. In prison interviews, Williams said, "I wasn't perfect. I lied sometimes. I was chasing dreams I couldn't catch. But I didn't kill those kids. And if they'd put me on trial for them, I would have fought." The Georgia Innocence Project has declined to take on Williams' case, citing lack of new exculpatory DNA evidence. Still, a small group of lawyers and activists continues to advocate on his behalf. In 2023, Wayne Williams turned 65. He has now spent more years behind bars than he spent as a free man. His name remains synonymous with the Atlanta child murders, though many of the victims' families refuse to acknowledge his guilt. Some say he'll die in prison. Others believe the full truth has yet to emerge. Either way, Williams remains the most controversial convicted killer in Georgia's history. A man seen by some as a monster, and by others as a martyr for a city's mistakes. Cultural reverberations. Long after the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, the story of the Atlanta child murders remained etched in the cultural conscience of America. The tragedy inspired books, films, television series, podcasts, and academic texts. Yet for many in Atlanta, especially those who lived through the terror, these representations often felt incomplete or too sanitized. In 2019, the Netflix series Manhunter dedicated its 2nd season to the case. Though dramatized, it reignited global interest and introduced a younger audience to the raw fear of 1980s Black Atlanta. Documentaries like Atlanta's Missing and Murdered, The Lost Children, HBO, and The Innocence Files, Netflix, examined both the investigation and the cultural neglect of Black victims in America. Artists responded to Outkast's S. Andre Senchen in interviews recalled growing up during the era. "I was just a little kid, but we couldn't play outside. You heard names like Wayne Williams before you knew what murder even meant." Childish Gambino's This Is America video featured imagery hinting at missing children and institutional blindness. Murals appeared in historically Black neighborhoods, often depicting angelic portraits of the lost children floating among clouds, holding hands, eyes wide open. Academics began to include the case in critical race theory discussions, studying how race, class, and urban policy shaped the course of the investigation. The case also redefined how America viewed missing persons reporting, especially in communities of color. It became a tragic benchmark, a never-again moment for activists and organizers pushing for equity in media coverage and law enforcement resources. Still, for many Atlantans, the case wasn't pop culture. It was personal memory, filled with sirens, shadows, and names they still whispered when the cameras were gone. Justice or closure? The question of justice in the Atlanta child murders is one with no easy answer. If justice means an arrest, a trial, and a conviction, then the system delivered. Wayne Williams is behind bars. The city did not ignore the killings forever. But if justice means truth, healing, and accountability for all parties involved, the answer is less clear. Only 2 murders were ever prosecuted. The remaining 27 were either attributed unofficially to Williams or left unresolved. For many, the decision to close those cases without trial was an act of political expediency, not justice. Justice also demands recognition of the structural failures: the slow response by police in the early days, the dismissal of black parents' pleas, the rush to declare the case solved. The media bias that allows so many victims to be treated as nameless statistics, and justice, at its deepest level, would require the city to fully acknowledge its failures, not just in speeches or documentaries, but in long-term policies to protect vulnerable children and honor their lives. Closure, meanwhile, is even more elusive. Grief that never had answers becomes something more than sorrow. It turns into legacy, activism, or resignation, but it rarely disappears. In Atlanta, justice and closure are 2 separate doors, and for many, neither has opened all the way. The children remembered, behind every headline, every fiber sample, and every political press conference, there were children, not victims, not case numbers. Children, they were funny, awkward, shy, playful. Some were musicians. Some dreamed of being pilots or firefighters. Others just wanted to ride their bikes, eat candy, or go to the movies with friends. Here are just a few. Yusuf Bell loved to sing in church and never missed a Sunday. Angel Lanier wrote poems and wore pink barrettes in her braids. Jeffrey Mathis liked comic books and was always fixing something with his hands. Patrick Baltazar adored dancing and was protective of his younger siblings. LaTanya Wilson, only 7, wanted to be a ballerina. They were sons, daughters, nieces, nephews living ordinary lives in neighborhoods that history rarely noticed until it was too late. In 2022, a new memorial park opened near the Atlanta Beltline. At its center stood a sculpture, 29 steel wind chimes, 1 for each child. Each chime bore a name. When the wind blew, the children spoke again. The city that would not forget. Atlanta in the 21st century is a vastly different city than it was in 1979. It is now a hub of black excellence, tech startups, and global film production. Its skyline gleams. Its neighborhoods are gentrifying. Its population is younger, more diverse, and more transient. But some things remain. The memory of the Atlanta child murders persists quietly, insistently, and often beneath the surface of public life. You'll find it in barbershops, where older men still lowered their voices when discussing Wayne Williams. You'll hear it in the soft tone of grandmothers reminding children to be careful after dark. You'll see it in the faces of those who grew up afraid to walk home alone. And now, finally, you'll see it in the form of remembrance, murals, plaques, city archives, and community events honoring the lost. Atlanta did not forget. For years, it tried to. It tried to bury the pain, tie it to one man, and move forward. But history does not fade on command. The voices of the dead remain. The truth refuses to stay buried. The Atlanta child murders were more than a crime spree. They were a reckoning, a test of empathy, a measure of how deeply a city can fail and whether it's willing to admit it. The story ends not with a final answer, but with a final vow. Never again. Not our children. Not like this.